Hello everyone and welcome to this panel with some of the contributors from the UCL Press book Georgette Heyer, History and Historical Fiction, which is out today. Hooray! So I'm joined by three of our contributors and we're going to talk a bit about the backgrounds to their chapters and why they love hair so much. First of all, we've got Kathleen Jennings. Kathleen is currently a PhD at the University of Queensland. Researching jurisprudence in fantastic story worlds. She's already got an MPhil in creative writing from the University of Queensland on the visual evocation of the sublime in Australian Gothic literature. And she's a book illustrator, and in 2020 won the World Fantasy Award for Best Artist. She's also published a number of short fantasy stories, and again award-winning, winning in 2019 and 2016 Ditmar Awards for Best Short Story. And her Australian Gothic novella Flyaway was published by Tor.com in the US and Picador, Australia in 2020. And of course, she is also working on a Regency novel. So welcome, Kathleen. We've also got Tom Zille. Tom trained as a bookseller and subsequently studied English and German literature and linguistics at Berlin and Cambridge. He's currently reading for a PhD in modern English literature at the University of Cambridge, and his first monograph, which is a study of the Enlightenment translator Christian Felix Weiser, is published by Imler Books. I hope I've said that correctly, Tom.
IMLR, but yeah.
IMLR, okay, I didn't. I'm sorry, everyone. Apologies for that. But welcome, Tom. And finally, but by no means leastly, we have Vanda Wilcox, who is a military historian whose research interests include the social and cultural representation of the First World War. She teaches European history at John Cabot University. Thank you, in Rome, and NYU Paris. And in 2006, she completed a DPhil at the University of Oxford, and her first book, Morale and the Italian Army in the First World War, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. Like all of us, she has been a keen reader and rereader of Georgette Heyer since childhood. So welcome, Vanda, as well. So thank you all so much for joining me. And we've got a couple of questions to ask you. So to start with, Kathleen, can you tell us a bit about the research you did for your chapter in the book, please?
Sure. My chapter is on Heyer in space. So it was an interesting one to research, looking at her influence on science fiction, particularly long form, quite militaristic science fiction. And my research for it actually began when I was going to science fiction and fantasy conventions and running into friends who liked Heyer and talking about Heyer. And then you'd mention the name and all these heads would pop up at the bar like meerkats, and not the people you'd expect at all. Often the very hard science fiction writers would be wandering over to talk about all these books. And that was just in the back of my mind as a thing that was happening. And then when I was doing some teaching as a class tutor in Kim Wilkins' genre fiction class at the University of Queensland, we were studying Venetia as one of the books, and trying to convince my students to give it a chance, to read it when they had no exposure to it. And especially everyone who was interested in hard military science fiction, trying to go, look, this is a book that weaponizes costume. It does things with rank and etiquette that makes sense if you're going to be writing a book that deals with any sort of military material. And then for other reasons, I was looking into the way modern Regency romance tends to be written, and I enjoy it quite a bit, but I was really noticing the split between what I was reading in Venetia and other books like that, and what I was reading in contemporary Regency romance, but also the similarities with what I was reading in what seemed on the surface like very different books. So I got really interested in that split that had happened in her readership between, not so much readership as her inheritors perhaps, between authors who were playing in that world, playing with that language, playing with the milieu and the costumes and the tropes on the one hand, and then people who had gone under that and taken the plot mechanics and the switchbacks and the chaotic inevitability of it, and were playing with that in worlds that have quite interesting sets of rules that the story can push back against the way it can in melodrama or a comedy of manners. And from there, I ended up getting into a lot of research over the last, well, pretty much the last century, really, and seeing how far back the fandom goes in science fiction for these novels, and reading lots of old write-ups, newsletters, blog posts summarizing panel discussions, people arguing over different subgenres, and acknowledging the debt that they owed, to the point that you could see all these authors going, oh, well, this is my space regency, or my publisher didn't notice, but I managed to get away with a space regency. You're like, nearly every book your publisher has ever published is a space regency, and also your publisher was a founding member of the Almax Society or of the Heyer Reading Group or something. I don't think it was as coincidental as people thought. So yes, that was a lot of the research I was doing following those threads.
Fantastic. Yes, and we've actually got Lois McMaster-Boujard, I think, on one of the other panels that we've got for some of these events, which is amazing for me as another science fiction fan as well. So thanks, Kathleen. Tom, your chapter talks about language in Heyer's books. Can you tell us a bit about the background to that?
Yes, I'm mainly focusing on the Regency romances, starting with Regency back in 1935, and I was curious to explore the origins of this famous Regency slang, and more broadly the idiom she employs in her historical novels. Because like Kathleen, I was struck by how different these novels are to everything else written in the genre. And to me, perhaps the most noticeable difference seemed to be the language, which is so unique and so recognizable. And I was fortunate enough to be given access to Heyer's private papers, which are now held by her daughter-in-law, Julie Rougier, who has these 50 binders in which Heyer collected index cards on which she recorded the information yielded by her research. And 2 of these are devoted to vocabulary, which are essentially just long lists of these wonderfully colorful expressions, idioms, and individual words that Heyer uses on all levels of her narration. And then I try to study this a bit more systematically across her oeuvre to see whether the use of that kind of language differs between levels of narration. So the chapter looks at that, how the narrative voice differs from the voices of the characters, for instance, and also to see how Heyer develops over the course of her career. And some really interesting things emerge from that. And also, quite frankly, while this is a scholarly endeavor, I really took just delight in highlighting some of these wonderful phrases and their meanings, which should be brought back into use, really, because they're so wonderful and long forgotten.
Agree, Tom. It's a fascinating chapter, and I am very jealous that you had access to all those famous binders that you talk about. So yeah, another great chapter. And then we've got Vanda. So it's no surprise, Vanda, as a military historian, that your chapter looks at military history and Heyer's kind of response to that. So your chapter is looking at Wellington's army. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting that as someone that we think of as a romance writer, Heyer is really interested in war. And actually there's a lot of wars, not only in the Regency novels, which obviously are set in the period of the Napoleonic Wars, but in some of the earlier ones, some of the slightly strange medieval novels, for example, or The Conqueror. She's even really interested not just in war, but specifically in battle. She writes these amazingly detailed battle scenes. And I think you can see her passion for historical research sometimes running away with the plot of the novel slightly in some of those books. But for me, the research for this specific chapter began just with noticing lots of things that made me think of the First World War. Now, my husband always tells me I can turn anything into being about the First World War, and I kind of see the First World War in everything. I think that's a danger when you work on something, you spot it everywhere. But I was beginning to think, these scenes in these Regency novels makes the Napoleonic Wars sound a lot like the First World War. I thought, is that just me seeing the First World War and everything? And so I had to go a bit out of my comfort zone to actually research the Napoleonic army, which is a long way from what I do, but challenging somewhat the sort of sacred idea of Heyer as incredibly accurate at all times. I wanted to see how much, of course, her research is there, and she did an immensely detailed research into the Napoleonic army. But I also wanted to see where imagery and ideas that she'd lived through in her own lifetime were creeping in and influencing her. And of course, she lived through the First World War as a teenager, and her father served, and she lived through the huge publishing boom in the 1920s and 30s of war memoirs. And so I wanted to see what influence those had on her as she shaped her own image of the Napoleonic era and of Wellington's army. So for me, it was a fun project to at once do something totally new, reading up about the Napoleonic military, or rather Wellington's army, and then bringing that back to the very familiar comfort zone of Heyer novels.
Yes, and it is a really interesting chapter. If any of you are interested in that the historical detail side of things, I think you really pull that out very well, Vanda. So thank you so much. I hope that's given everyone just a little flavour of some of the chapters in the book. And now I'm more interested to ask some of our contributors how they encountered Heyer's works, what your favourites are, and why you think Heyer has such an enduring appeal for readers. So Kathleen, can I come back to you, and could you give us a bit of your background to Heyer, please?
Sure. I'm not 100% sure how I first came across Heyer, except that it must have been a couple of books in a box of old books, or that I picked up at a secondhand bookstore when I was probably in my early teens. And it would have been either Sprig Muslin or Friday's Child. And I just can't quite remember which it was. And then a few years after that, I started really sinking into them, finding more, realizing other people were reading them and wanted to talk about them. So my favorite is usually the one I've most recently reread, because I'm also in a Georgette Heyer book club. It's always fun because we're cycling back through the Heyers now, and so we're adding in another book alongside it that appeals to us in the same way. So it's quite an eclectic mixture. So we've just reread Pharaoh's Daughter, and I'm not sure if I hold it up, if you'll be able to see the spine. I've just been going through flagging all the phrases that I like this time and trying to work out why this one appeals to me. And I always liked it. I like it so much more this time, but I also love The Foundling. When I reread The Foundling, I adored it. We read Powder and Patch recently. I was like, oh, it's a makeover novel. It's a training montage makeover novel. So I think my favorites shift, but I still always love Friday's Child, of just this group of young people attempting to raise each other as adults with no good role models of how to do it. And I love that as a plot mechanism. The enduring appeal for me and among the readers of Heyer that I see is probably that plot mechanic, that inevitable slither towards chaos aspect, but also the utter assurance of what she's doing. And I'm sure part of that comes from her confidence in her own research. But if you're not reading the books for the historical accuracy, and if you are reading other authors who are in that descent from her novels and see that same degree of assurance in books which are entirely fictional, it's quite remarkable to see. And even in authors who are deliberately evading history or historical accuracy, there's this off-the-cuff feeling, this utter sense, at least, of control of the material, and that you'll be along for a very good ride. And also, to an extent, characters who are real but slightly smaller than real life. And I always think of the fairies in Peter Pan, who are only big enough for one emotion at a time. And it's like everyone's in this little concave world, and the author moves them around and makes terrible things happen to them, but they're so earnest that this is actually their real world, and they're running around getting into terrible situations. So I think from what I see in the authors who I see writing in her shadow, that's part of the enduring appeal.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And yeah, I think we've all encountered Heyer in old boxes. I love that. You know, there's still that hope, isn't there? Wherever you go, is there going to be a box with some? There's
a primary school at the end of my street, and I went down year before last and was going through the books, and there was an entire box of Heyers for $5. So I bought it. I was like, I shouldn't have done that. I already own them all, but now I can give them to friends.
I think as another Heyer fan, we all completely get that, Kathleen. So Tom, coming to you, and I mean, Kathleen's mentioned a few of Heyer's titles there. I mean, Pharaoh's Daughter, for instance, is one of those which is full of that Heyer language that you talk about in your chapter. So yeah, I'm interested how you encountered Heyer's works, what your favourites are, and how you think Heyer has managed to maintain this enduring appeal with readers.
So I think you mentioned at some point that there's a contribution in the collection by Helen David, which actually, among other things, looks at how people discovered Heyer. And I felt I stood apart from the mainstream in as much as being German, I didn't discover Heyer naturally, as it were, because she's not quite as popular over here, even though she's been translated. I discovered her via Stephen Fry's public acknowledgement of his love for Heyer, which seems to be a popular part, but not as popular as meeting her through your mother, apparently. Perhaps through that, I also just adopted Stephen Fry's particular liking for the Reluctant Widow, which is quite interesting in terms of the language and the idiom as well. But that is still one of my favorites. So I also have a soft spot for The Spanish Bride. I couldn't particularly say why. I think it might just be the reading. It's it's not so oppressively British like many of the others. And as for the enduring appeal, that's a difficult question for me, because I find Heyer quite a complicated writer in some way, because I sometimes find it difficult to enjoy her as a reader wholeheartedly, because her social assumptions can be rather reactionary. There's a good deal of classism and xenophobia and so on in many of her novels. But at the same time, there's this technical perfection, as Kathleen said, this self-assurance. Everything's put together just right, and that just brings me back to these novels time and again. Not just the language, but plot construction, character construction. Many of the contributions to our collection talk about that. It's just so terribly accomplished that you just can't ignore it, and you can take a pure delight in the technical perfection of it all.
Yes, no, I completely agree, and I think that's part of the mysterious appeal, in a way, that despite the fact that there is, as you say, Heyer does write very much from her time, and she was very much part of a class system, and seems to have been quite proud of her place within that. So, but despite that, readers, even in 2021, are still finding something new that appeals to them about it. So, yeah, that's very interesting. So that brings us back to you, Vanda. So from a historian's perspective then, I want to be surprised by your favourites and how you encountered Heyer's work. Was it from a historian's point of view, or how did that happen?
Well, I'm one of the people Tom just mentioned who met Heyer through her mother. My mother gave me my first Heyer when I was probably about 13, and it was These Old Shades, which is just wonderful. And as an adult, maybe you look at some of the slightly odd and problematic bits of it, but as a teenager, it was just perfect. And I completely ate it up. And then I proceeded through all the rest. My mum has the complete collection. She has lots of them in the beautiful hardback first editions with the Barbosa covers, which are so lovely.
Beautiful.
I loved The Spanish Bride from early on, that connected to me historically. But actually my favourite is A Civil Contract. I love A Civil Contract. I think it's very different from her others. Many people find it unromantic, but it's, to me, the kind of realism and maturity of it, I think, is so satisfying. But I think the question of enduring appeal is really interesting, because I don't read romance novels. She's the only romance author that I read. And I've tried one or two and I've never really got on with them. And I think there's actually quite a lot of readers who love Heyer and who don't enjoy other romance writers. And I think that really that's her technical skill, as Tom was saying, as a writer. She's so funny. I mean, I could be reading a book for the 4th or 5th time and it will still make me laugh out loud. And I love her big closing set pieces, these big dramatic scenes where she pulls all the different threads together and there's some sort of hilarious showdown and the baddies get their comeuppance and everything is somehow magically fixed. And that time and again you get these big dramatic closing scenes, and they're romantic, but they're also just hilarious. And I think it's that ability to take you away from everything, and you do trust her as a writer. You might not like necessarily her values or her perspective always, but she knows exactly where she wants to take you, and you can just relax, put yourself in her hands, and she's gonna take you on this journey. You don't necessarily know how you're gonna get there, but you completely have faith in her. And for the time that you're inside the novel, you forget everything else. And I think her ability to do, I mean, yes, okay, it's escapism, as she said herself, but it's more than that. She takes you away from everything, I think, as convincingly in 2021 as she did when she was first published. So I think a lot of pandemic reading of Heyer has been going on, actually.
Yeah, she is the perfect kind of comfort read.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Vanda. So I hope from this very kind of brief introduction to some of the chapters and hearing some of our contributors' favourites and where they encountered Heyer for the first time, it's whetted your appetite to enjoy the other events that we've got on for you today to celebrate the launch of the book, and that you'll take the opportunity to download a copy of the collection of essays and enjoy them for yourself. So thank you very much to Kathleen and Tom and to Vanda for joining me. And yes, keep enjoying Heyer, everybody. Let's hope that in another 100 years' time, there'll be another panel and another collection of books and people will still be enjoying her works. So thank you, everybody, very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.